These three medical mistakes show up in so many of the medical malpractice cases that we get. And as a legal nurse consultant, your ability to spot them could be worth millions to an attorney's case. I'm Randy Lovelace. I've been a nurse for over 27 years, working everywhere from bedside care to the C-suite. I also own a thriving legal nurse consulting firm, and I've reviewed thousands of medical records. I can tell you that certain patterns of medical errors appear over and over again. And today, I'm going to share the top 3 medical mistakes that legal nurse consultants encounter most frequently. And more importantly, I'll show you exactly how to identify them in your medical record analysis. This sort of knowledge could make the difference between a case that settles for thousands versus one that settles for millions. Now, before we dive into the specific mistakes, let me explain why this matters so much for legal nurse consultants. See, when attorneys hire us, they're not just looking for someone to summarize medical records. They need medical experts who can identify the clinical issues that will make or break your case. Your ability to spot these common mistakes and more importantly, to explain their significance in clear, compelling language, that's what separates exceptional LNCs from those who just organize timelines. So let's get into it. Mistake number 1 is medication errors. Medication errors are among the most common and potentially devastating mistakes in healthcare. And they're often the foundation of successful medical malpractice cases. There are a few different types of medication errors to look for. Wrong drug administration. Look for discrepancies between what was ordered and what was given. This could show up in a number of ways, like pharmacy documentation showing one medication dispense, nursing notes indicating a different medication administered, patient reactions that are inconsistent with the intended medication. Another error we see is dosage errors, and these can be particularly dangerous and legally significant. Decimal point error, like instead of 0.1 milligrams, it's 0.01 or 1.0. Unit confusion, milligrams versus micrograms, missing that little C. Weight-based dosing errors. You see that a lot in pediatric or critical care patients. Pump programming errors, when you're giving IV medications and the pump either malfunctions or isn't programmed properly, which is more typically the case. Another place to look, timing and frequency errors. Medications that are given too frequently or not frequently enough. And again, you got to look at the medical records. You got to figure out what the orders were, what the patient indications were before really making that judgment call. Critical meds that can be missed during shift changes. Shift change is a critical time for any errors to happen. PRN medications that are given inappropriately or withheld when they really were indicated. Another place to look, drug interaction issues. A new med started without checking for interactions, continuation of medications that might have been contraindicated due to med combinations or the patient's symptoms. Failure to adjust doses when interacting medications are added. And I want to talk to you about how to actually spot these medication errors in the records. Look for documentation gaps when reviewing medical record administration records, MARs. Look for things like missing initials or signatures, time gaps in critical medication administration, different handwriting or initials that don't really have an explanation, obvious corrections or documentation timestamps that don't match the administration times. And you can do complete chart audits on the timelines to find this stuff out. Cross-reference multiple sources. Don't just rely on the MAR. Compare things like the physician orders with the pharmacy records, pharmacy dispensing with nursing administration, patient response with the expected medication effects, lab values with medication timing, and watch for red flag language, phrases that should raise immediate questions like patient found unresponsive, unexpected reaction, medication error discovered, pharmacy contacted for clarification. These can all be things to look for in the records that could indicate there's a little more to dig in there. Clinical correlation is also super important. Look for patient symptoms that don't match the intended treatment. So like sedation when stimulants were ordered, or continued pain even when analgesics were supposedly given. Electrolyte imbalances inconsistent with the prescribed medication. Medication errors like these often provide really clear causation links between healthcare actions and patient harm. They're also easier for juries to understand than complex medical procedures. Now, when you identify a medication error, document the specific nature of the error, when it occurred in the timeline, what the correct action should have been, and the potential or actual consequences, as well as whether the error was caught and corrected or whether they never even knew it happened. Okay, moving on to mistake number 2, inaccurate documentation from copy, paste, and pull forward functions. Guys, this is becoming increasingly common with electronic health records and is creating some serious legal vulnerabilities for healthcare providers. Electronic health records allow us as providers to copy previous entries and paste them into current documentation, or maybe a pull forward of information from previous encounters. So it keeps you from having to document as much, right? Or as time consuming. But there are a number of reasons why these types of errors can happen. Time pressure and efficiency demands, desire for comprehensive documentation that it's way easier just to pull it forward or to copy paste it. Habit and convenience, EMR systems that are actually designed to encourage this practice. And the legal problem here is that it creates documentation that appears comprehensive, but could be completely inaccurate for the current patient situation because the situation's changed, but yet the documentation stays the same. And to identify as a legal nurse the copy-paste errors, look for red flags like repetitive language. If you see identical phrases appearing in multiple entries, that's very likely a copy-paste or pull forward. Assessment findings that don't change over days or weeks, and yes, we see this, literally the exact same assessment. Physical exam findings that are impossibly consistent. Vital signs as well, impossibly consistent. Progress notes that use identical language across different shifts. Look for date and time inconsistencies, like references to events that happened on different dates or timestamps that don't align with the narrative. Mentions of procedures or tests that are not documented elsewhere, or assessment findings that contradict other contemporaneous notes. Keep an eye out for impossible clinical scenarios as well, like patient described as ambulating in the hallway when they're on bed rest or when they're completely immobile. A normal neurological exam copied for an unconscious patient. Seen it happen. Detailed conversation notes between a nurse and a patient, and the patient's intubated. And they're having conversation, right? I mean, there can be communication, but it's probably not detailed conversation notes. Look for things like pain assessments copied for patients under anesthesia. You'd be surprised what you find when you keep a keen eye out. Look for things like contradictory information as well. Nursing notes describing different symptoms than the physician notes. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but there definitely could be. Assessment findings that contradict vital signs or lab values. Treatment responses that don't match the medication administration. Or patient education documented for confused or unconscious patients when they literally could not have been educated. So keep an eye out for these red flags and phrases like patient continues to, or will continue to monitor, or as previously noted, ongoing assessment reveals, patient remains. These are things that don't necessarily mean there's a problem, but could be a red flag and cue you in to something that's going on deeper in the records. And you sometimes really have to do the detective work. Compare across disciplines. Look for inconsistencies between nursing assessment and physician exams, therapy notes and nursing observation, patient complaints and documented findings, family reports and staff documentation. Really analyze the timeline and create a detailed timeline that compares when events supposedly occurred, when documentation was actually entered, whether the timing makes clinical sense or not, if the sequences of events is logical. And ask yourself, clinically correlate the documentation. So does the document or the documented findings, do they match the patient's condition? Are the assessment findings physiologically possible? Do the interventions match the documented problems? Are the patient responses realistic if those treatments were really given? And if you find documentation discrepancies, there can be any number of legal implications. An accurate copy and paste documentation can undermine the credibility of all the medical records, because if you did it once, who's to say that it's all correct in the rest of the documentation, right? It can create false impressions about the quality of care. It can hide the actual problems or the complications that really were there. And it can make it difficult to establish accurate timelines. All right, moving on to mistake number 3. I think this is the final mistake I'm going to talk about today: incomplete assessments with missed changes in patient conditions. Now, this most often can be the most devastating type of error, because it represents missed opportunities to prevent serious complications or sometimes death. And what constitutes an incomplete assessment are things like cursory evaluations that miss significant findings, or failure to follow up on abnormal findings. Maybe there is an abnormal finding documented and then nothing. Inadequate monitoring of high-risk patients. They're noted to be high risk, you know they're high risk, and then nothing. Missing or delayed recognition of deterioration in their conditions. So maybe they are deteriorating, but the assessment's not picking up on it. Or the assessment is picking up on it and nothing's being done. So why does this happen? Oftentimes understaffing. We know today, guys, we are so understaffed in hospitals. Time pressures are huge. Sometimes there's a lack of experience or training or orientation, because they got to get you off orientation and get you there taking care of patients. Sometimes it's poor communication between various providers in a very complex environment. Can be inadequate protocols for monitoring, or sometimes laziness, lack of effort. It happens. And there are typically some common patterns of assessment failures that you can find in the records. And one thing to look for is missed early warning signs. Look for things like documentation that shows gradual changes in vital signs that just simply weren't recognized by the nurse or the physician. Look for patient complaints that weren't adequately investigated, or family concerns that were simply dismissed or ignored. And we know how that goes. Look for subtle changes in mental status that simply went unnoticed. And also make sure there wasn't failure to act on assessment findings. Abnormal findings documented, but no follow-up ordered. Patient deterioration noted, but the physician wasn't notified. Concerning symptoms present, but not escalated appropriately. Or changes in conditions documented, but no intervention planned or executed. And keep an eye out for inadequate reassessments, long gaps between assessments, and unstable patients or deteriorating patients. Failure to reassess after interventions. Missing reassessments after med administration. Inadequate monitoring after procedures. So here, let me tell you how to identify assessment failures in the records. Look for documentation patterns like sudden dramatic changes in the patient condition without warning signs, or long periods with minimal or routine documentation, but then the patient ends up in a much deteriorated situation. Assessment findings that don't prompt appropriate interventions, or gaps in monitoring during critical periods. Analyze the timeline and create a detailed timeline showing when the assessment findings first appeared, how long it took for intervention, whether the response was appropriate for the findings in the records, if there were missing opportunities for early interventions. All these things can really point to medication errors or gaps in care. And watch for communication failures. We work in a complex environment. Nursing assessments are not always communicated to the physician, and abnormal findings might be documented but not reported, and the right people don't know about them. Family concerns can be noted but never investigated or looked into. And shift-to-shift communication gaps are huge. So many errors happen when we're changing over care. Look for knowledge gaps, like providers didn't understand the significance of the findings, failed to recognize patterns of deterioration, or they missed classic signs of specific conditions. Sometimes there's evidence I've seen before where the nurse or the physician simply didn't follow evidence-based assessment protocols. And as you're completing your analysis, there can be a number of red flag scenarios to watch for. Sudden catastrophic events when the records show the patient was fine and then suddenly crashed. No warning signs documented. Dramatic change with no clear precipitating events. Family surprised by a sudden deterioration. Look for ignored warning signs like abnormal vital sign trends that just simply weren't identified or addressed. Patient complaints that weren't investigated. Changes in behavior or mental status not being explored appropriately. Physical findings that weren't followed up on. And watch for evidence of communication breakdown like we've already talked about. Important findings not communicated between shifts. Family concerns not passed along to docs. Abnormal test results not acted upon, or critical information that's simply lost in handoff. And consider using clinical correlation techniques by asking yourself some logical questions like, do the documented findings make sense when you put them all together? Are there missing pieces that could explain the patient's condition? Would a competent nurse have recognized these patterns? And by competent, guys, I mean a nurse if you only had that one patient. Because typically the law, the courts, they don't care how many other patients you have if you drop a ball on one. So would a reasonable and prudent, competent nurse in the same situation have done the same thing? What should have triggered further assessment? What protocols should have been followed but weren't? When should have physicians been notified but not? What reassessment intervals were appropriate? And did the documented care meet professional standards? Understanding these mistakes is crucial, but knowing how to present them in legal context is what makes you valuable as a legal nurse consultant. And each of these mistakes can provide critical elements for legal cases. Medication errors often provide clear causation links. Documentation errors undermine credibility, can hide problems to the untrained eye. It's where we're so valuable. Assessment failures show deviation from standards of care, and your job as a legal nurse is to help attorneys tell that story of what went wrong. Explain the clinical significance in a language anyone could understand. Nobody cares how smart you are if they can't understand what you're saying. Show how the mistake could have been prevented. Demonstrate the impact on the patient and their outcome. Provide the medical foundation for damages and claims. Your analysis of these mistakes help attorneys choose the right expert witness, prepare experts for deposition and trial, understand the medical issues well enough to ask good and smart questions. It also helps them anticipate defense arguments and prepare responses. Or if you're on defense, plaintiff arguments and prepare responses. Improve settlement negotiations, win in court. And spotting these mistakes consistently, it's going to require ongoing education and a systematic approach. So stay current on medication safety protocols and common error patterns. Stay current on electronic health record systems and their vulnerabilities. Stay current on evidence-based assessment protocols for different patient populations and quality improvement initiatives in healthcare. Learn how to create detailed timelines that reveal these patterns, to cross-reference multiple data sources, to identify inconsistencies and gaps in documentation, to correlate clinical findings with the expected outcomes. Because you need to study how these mistakes translate into standard of care violations, causation arguments, damage calculations, credibility issues, because this is exactly what the attorney wants, and it's exactly what we teach in the Catalyst program. Not just how to spot the mistakes, but how to analyze their legal significance and present them effectively to attorneys. See, the ability to identify the critical medical mistakes and understand their legal significance, that's what separates Catalyst legal nurses from all others, from those who just summarize records or create timelines. And this expertise, it's not going to develop overnight. It requires systematic training, ongoing education, guidance from experienced legal nurse professionals, mentors to show you the way. And in our Catalyst coaching and mentoring program, we teach you not just how to spot these mistakes, but how to analyze their clinical and legal significance, to present your findings in compelling, understandable language, to build strong arguments that support attorney case strategies, to develop the expertise that's going to make you invaluable to the legal teams that you work with. In fact, in Catalyst, we provide case studies, we provide practice exercises, And we give you individualized feedback to help you master all these critical skills. You're not alone in learning it. Check out our free training by clicking below, where I show you how to develop the clinical and legal expertise that makes legal nurse consultants truly valuable to attorneys. Again, the link's in the description below. Your expertise in identifying these critical mistakes could be the key to building a successful, high-value legal nurse consulting practice. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.